Welcome back to our series, Climate Talk. We are the economists from the Office of Sustainable Growth at the Bank of Korea. I am Taeyoung Kim, and here with me today is my colleague, Dayoung Kang.
Hi everyone, it's great to be back for our second episode. Last time we explored extreme weather events and their systematic impacts with Dr. Kakunuber from Columbia University and EASA. Today, we're shifting gears to the critical role of sustainable finance in managing climate risk.
Right. Sustainable finance and ESG investing have increasingly become essential tools for promoting sustainability and driving climate transition across global markets. To explore this important topic, we are delighted to have with us today John Goldstein, Managing Director at Goldman Sachs Asset and Wealth Management, serving as the Global Head of Sustainability.
John brings extensive experience to this conversation. He previously founded Imprint Capital, playing a key role in expanding Goldman Sachs' ESG and impact investing capabilities. He also led the firm's Sustainable Finance Group with a focus on inclusive growth and the climate transition. In addition to that, he has advised a number of global impact organizations, including Global Impact Investing Network and the UN Capital Development Fund. So we are very pleased to have him with us today.
Now, let's welcome John. Thank you so much for being here today, John. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's very inspiring that you're having this series, and I'm honored to get to participate.
So John, you've worked across consulting, asset management, and policy advisory roles. What led you to specialize in sustainable finance? Was there a defining moment or experience that shifted how you view the intersection of capital and impact?
I think that's a great question of how I ended up walking through what I think of as a one-way door. Because once you've had a chance to work on important problems that matter, it's hard to think about doing anything else with your career. So about 25 years ago, I was working for, as you noted, a consultancy that worked on generating information about the policy world that would affect markets. Two different communities that often spoke very different languages, but were really dependent on each other for a huge number of global issues. And there was one specific lunch that I went to with two important global leaders who were really wrestling with this question of looking at these big untapped issues, these big unaddressed issues around the world. It could be around poverty or the environment, how to harness capital, how to engage the capital markets, because that's the scale of capital needed to really unlock some of these opportunities. And seeing the struggles they were having to make those connections, to bridge that world, a light bulb went off for me that this question of these two worlds talking past each other, finding some way to find the common ground where the power of capital markets, the scale of capital markets could get harnessed for solving real world problems. It just at that point really captivated me and really has led to everything that I've done since then.
Okay, ESG investing includes a range of strategies from negative screening to impact-first investment. Could you briefly introduce the main categories of ESG investing and explain how different investors, institutional, retail, government, typically engage with these approaches?
It's such an important foundational question to start with. Which is even from back when I co-founded Imprint Capital in 2007. This question of language and people using different words to mean the same things and the same words to mean different things have really plagued this industry and led to confusion, sometimes misunderstanding. And so I think for us to really break it down into some of these fundamentally different tools, the first, as you mentioned, there's a long history of negative screening. What we often call values alignment, which is investors going back to faith-based investors hundreds of years ago, have made a conscious choice to say there are certain things that they don't want to invest in for their own moral or values-based reasons. That discipline has grown in different parts of the world across different issues that are important to people. But that world of negative screening, which is largely around what to not own as part of aligning with your values, much more of an ethical or values-based decision. Starting about 20 years ago, though, a new topic started to emerge around integrating environmental social governance factors into investment processes, because there was a recognition that as the world evolved, you had new drivers of risk, of opportunity, and things that could impact the operations of companies with physical capital, with human capital. And trying to understand these issues and integrate in a meaningful way to help drive investment performance is the basis of that concept of integration. It is often confused with that first topic of values alignment. However, values alignment is about the values that an individual, an institution, or a group may hold. Integration is all about value, driving long-term value for investors. And then finally, a topic near and dear to my heart from my early days, co-founding Imprint Capital, working with great leaders in the industry, up to the work that I do today, is impact investing, which is starting, almost 20 years ago. A group of individuals came together to really identify the fact that, there was this discipline around values and exclusions. There was integrating a dynamic world and how it was changing into regular way investing. But there was also a growing set of businesses, innovation, entrepreneurship technologies that were finding business models to solve social and environmental problems, where the addressable market, the size of the gap, it could be access to education or addressing issues around reforestation or access to water. That market gap was the addressable market. And people were coming up with entrepreneurship opportunities, with businesses, with ways to invest that would tackle that problem. And the business case was the impact case, and that was really impact investing. And so these three different disciplines, I think, once again, often you have a little bit of an alphabet soup that lumps them all together, but I think separating them out because they're suitable and pursued for different reasons, in different ways, by different types of investors. And so I'm glad you're starting with what remains, to the degree it was back 18 years ago when I co-founded Imprint Capital, a foundational question to begin these kinds of conversations.
How has the ESG and the sustainable investing landscape evolved since you began your career in this area? ESG investing was once niche, but has become increasingly mainstream. What factors have driven this shift?
Yeah, I like to say it's gone from the fringe to the periphery to the core. And that journey is in some ways reflected in my own journey. From co-founding a very small company called Imprint Capital in 2007, initially working with large foundations, family offices, and others that were just deeply focused in this issue, to now doing what I do as head of sustainability for Goldman Sachs' asset and wealth business, and working with some of the largest pools of capital around the world. This topic, needless to say, has grown and evolved quite a bit. One of the questions, though, is not just how it's evolved, but really why. And I think we've seen a couple of key elements that have reinforced each other. I think, first of all, you've seen the evolution of the underlying business case in a lot of these investments. If you think about the economics of something like solar energy or energy storage, what that looked like in 2007, in 2015, and today has transformed tremendously. How technology has enabled people to find ways to innovate in areas like education or access to healthcare. The underlying technology, business models, and business cases around a lot of these themes have changed quite substantially. So what's happened then is, as you have better underlying economics, you start getting great entrepreneurs. Great entrepreneurs tend to attract great investors, right? And so this virtuous cycle of, as the underlying real economy drivers have accelerated, you've attracted talent to build businesses, and that talent has attracted capital from leading investors. And that virtuous cycle, right? Real world growth, great entrepreneurs, great investors, feeds on itself, helps grow these industries and the ecosystems around that. That means that when you look at the opportunity set today, once upon a time, we had to look long and hard to find ways to put capital to work, with quality investment managers, with great entrepreneurs. And now you see, specialist investment firms globally. You see some of the biggest investment firms in the world, ours as well as many of our peers, actively engaged in these themes. None of that could have happened without the growth of sort of these themes in the real economy, but it's been reinforced by its ability to attract human capital. And as I said, that investment capital. So that virtuous cycle has put us in a fundamentally different place, where these are large, robust markets that play out on a global basis.
So while ESG has clearly gained momentum, I think the policy landscape still plays a critical role in shaping its direction. And given some of the recent shifts we've seen today, how do you think the new U.S. administration stance on climate and environmental policy, potentially rolling back some prior initiatives, might affect the broader ESG investing landscape? And in particular, what impact could this have on investor sentiment?
So just even to step back half a step, leaving aside sustainable investing, investing in general has to keep a watchful eye on how policy unfolds on a global basis. We live in a complex, very dynamic world globally across a wide variety of issues, and sustainable investing is no exception. And so to navigate that, sustainability is not so different from other types of investing, which is number one, realize and really assess this question of how dependent do you want to be on any one policy driver in any one market, right? To try to find robust and resilient investments where maybe policy can be a bonus, but it's not a dependency. I think number two, what's also important to realize is this is a complex global policy ecosystem. Even within the United States, you have states, you have the federal government, you have a whole host of governmental entities. I'm doing this sitting here in Japan, where the Japanese government has a very ambitious climate program called GX. We have Europe, you have Asian policymakers. So policymakers on a global basis are taking a variety of approaches to this. And investors need to navigate this the same as they would any other policy landscape, right? Which is with no less rigor and no less care than anyone needs to take navigating a dynamic world. And so I think fundamentally at the end of the day, the business case needs to bear itself out, right? Finding great businesses with great value propositions for their customers and investing in them, all the while navigating both the risks and opportunities of a complex policy landscape. But as we know, sometimes, the real world moves like this, and sometimes sentiment can move more widely. And as I've talked to some of my clients, their view is that gap between movement in sentiment and movement in the real underlying drivers can present real opportunities. And so keeping a clear head through what can seem like volatility in both policy and sentiment tends to be good practice for investors, whatever the issue may be.
Andy, another question that I want to bring you is that there has been a lot of debate and some skepticism about whether ESG investing actually leads to an emission reduction. And from your perspective, what are the mechanisms, if any, that link ESG investing to actual decarbonization outcomes in the economy?
I think it's a great question, and I think this is a real lesson that's being learned by the industry over time as it evolves. Right, which is, we actually published a paper about a year and a half ago called Climate Metrics 2.0, Measuring What Matters. And I think the crux of it, both within a lot of the climate data, but also broadly in the field, is there's a fundamental difference of whether you're solving for really what, the optics of a product or a label versus an underlying thesis. And I think this is an important element that the industry is evolving on, which is there were a lot of 1.0 approaches, which there was a perceived market demand for product. And those products often had similar characteristics, the optics of looking sustainable, I think with the best of intentions. But the question is when you get under the hood, right? For example, we saw a creation of a whole host of low emissions products. But here's the question. A lot of the economic opportunity and the decarbonization potential comes from really two types of investments: investing in transitioning heavy industry and investing in the growth of climate solutions that decarbonize other parts of the economy as their growth pathway. One of the challenges with these emissions and labeling focused approaches is both of those types of investments have higher carbon footprints than the broader market. And so if the goal is to reduce the perceived carbon footprint of an investment product, it will actually dissuade someone from investing in some of these things that can unlock real world financial value and real world decarbonization around investing in transitioning heavy industry and investing in climate solutions. And so a lot of this evolution is to, number one, have a very clear thesis. Where does someone see that intersection of, real world value and an investment thesis that makes sense? Not the optics of that, not a label, not a claim, but at the end of the day, a real thesis of what's really under the hood, what's really driving things. And number two, how do you execute that thoughtfully, like with really any investment strategy? And so finding those theses, finding an idea where the way you drive financial value is aligned with some of that real world decarbonization, I think that's where a lot of the thinking is evolving. It's not about looking like someone is being thoughtful with investing in these themes. It's about actually being thoughtful investing in these themes. And so that's an evolution, not just around decarbonization investing, but also broadly in the field, this sort of evolution from products that were really designed to solve for a perceived market demand versus designing products that are really built to perform, right? One of the analyses that we did is we looked at the performance, for example, of sustainable equity funds over the last 5 years. And we found the biggest drivers of performance were not particularly about sustainability. They were largely about some of the biases and tilts embedded in the construction of those products, right? There was a period of time when, for example, they tended to be overweight technology stocks, overweight growth stocks, and underweight energy stocks. And those biases performed quite well for a few years, but when the macro environment changed, those tailwinds suddenly became headwinds. And I think we've seen this quite frequently, which is designing for the optics of what someone thinks a product should look like is not the same as having a clear thesis and thoughtful and rigorous implementation. I think that's the case with, I think, going back to your question of really, if the view is how to unlock economic value through real world decarbonization, it's really having a clear thesis, using metrics and data that are fit for purpose, and executing with the same rigor and care you would any other investment strategy.
I think I have to ask this question, John. Beyond the popular sectors like renewable energy or electric vehicles, what other industries or regions do you find particularly promising or underexplored in the sustainable finance?
So I think it's a great question, because I do find a huge amount of the airtime. I was telling a client recently that 90% of the time I was spending with their board was really spent focused talking about this very narrow question around renewable power, when it's one of a great number of sectors and subsectors to look at within sustainable finance. And when I worked with a lot of our leadership around the firm to come up with our sustainable finance approach back in 2019, in the executive office running the sustainable finance group, we identified 9 underlying sustainable growth themes with a whole set of sub themes. So within climate, and energy transition, we saw clean energy, but it's not just around generating it, it's energy efficiency, it's storing it, it's moving it, it's the grid. Sustainable food and agriculture, right? From inputs to production to consumption. Sustainable transportation, which doesn't just include EVs, but a whole value chain around that. Waste and materials, really circularity, right? How we reuse, use less, or use different materials. And then finally, ecosystem services around carbon, waste, and water. So real diversity of themes, even just within the broader umbrella of climate transition. And then under inclusive growth, right? So sometimes inclusion gets left out of this conversation, but I think we see really large addressable markets and great innovation, business models, and investment opportunities around affordable and accessible healthcare, affordable, accessible, impactful education, access to financial services, and meeting important community needs. And so for us, they're really interesting opportunities across this much wider spectrum of approaches. But I think for us, oftentimes the key question is not which of those themes or sub-themes. It's what are the characteristics of investments across, as you noted earlier in the conversation, a complex macro environment, an evolving policy landscape. How across those themes and sub-themes to find opportunities where you can invest with conviction and a margin of safety. I think we've really identified 4 underlying themes that I think are important to navigate those different industries and sub-industries. The first is, we see a real shift as some of these thematics are growing faster, some are growing more slowly, and some are actually shrinking. So for example, in energy transition, we see a lot of proven economical technologies, further in on the decarbonization cost curve are growing faster, those are accelerating. And we see some of the further out themes are actually decelerating. So on the more cost-effective elements, you see things like solar and energy storage. On the less cost-effective side, things that are slowing down, we see investments in things like hydrogen and carbon capture. So that's point 1. Find one of these accelerating growth themes. Number 2, and this gets back to your question about policy, I think it's important to have a core value proposition that is robust and resilient across macro and policy drivers. So a good example of that is saving your customers money, right? Finding a way you can provide a product or service that saves them money, or providing something that is a must-have, not a nice-to-have, but is a must-have, and doing it better than your competition. So having this really strong value proposition that's going to work whether you have high interest rates or low interest rates, high inflation, low inflation, across all of these different dynamics is point 2. Point 3 is be thoughtful around where to be in the value chain of these innovations. So you could have these strongly growing markets, but being thoughtful about where to play, because the front end of supply chains are often commoditized, very competitive. The tail end are often very volatile and margin compressed. So finding some of those areas in the middle, these picks and shovel spaces where you can benefit from the growth in volume, but have a more protected market position. And finally, the fourth point is to be very sensitive to the supply and demand of capital. Some areas actually have an abundance of capital, which tends to have impacts on valuations and pricing. Some areas are undersupplied with capital, but there you need to determine which of the three following statements is true. Number one, some areas are undersupplied, but for a good reason, right? They don't have attractive fundamentals. They don't do very well in those first three traits that I outlined. Number two, some may be interesting, but they're very dependent on that sentiment to raise large amounts of capital in an ongoing way, right? That creates a real risk for downstream financing. But the third category are things that are robust and don't have that downstream dependency. I think that imbalance of supply and demand of capital tends to give a real margin of safety to invest when you really take those broad themes, but you really figure out how to capture them.
Okay, to wrap up, for those looking to help build a more sustainable financial system, whether they are students, policymakers, or new investors, where's the best place to start? What actions or areas of focus are the most effective at the early stages?
So, this is a question I've gotten asked at every point in my career, and my answer always evolves. And I think the good news is now, once upon a time, if people said they want to do it, I'd say, oh, very few jobs, very few opportunities, but good luck. Then as the industry started to grow, there were a growing set of jobs really designated in the sustainability space in some fashion. But I think where we are now is, as so many of these themes have gotten embedded in just the broader economy, the good news is people can start their career in a really wide variety of places and have a chance to do their part relative to this work, right? It's showing up increasingly across businesses and across the financial sector. And I think the big thing I would tell people is focus less on I'm in this specific role in this specific institution, but really two things. One, find ways that you can really make your contribution on these issues. But two, to make that contribution, it requires pursuing this with more rigor, more care, and more discipline. I think one thing that sometimes people have not always gotten right in this industry is the thought that because some of the underlying issues may be important, that means they should, maybe not be quite as rigorous or quite as diligent. And I find the opposite is true. Back when we founded, Imprint Capital, I think one of the things that we've always used as a mantra is we're either creating proof points and models of success or cautionary tales. The stakes of executing well, of using that rigor, that care and discipline to try to drive results that matter is, that's the way you show tribute to how significant these issues are, bringing more care, more rigor and discipline. Because if we do the work well, we create those proof points, those models of success, and capital, success begets success. Capital follows capital. We are either doing that or creating those cautionary tales. And so I would encourage everybody to do the former and not the latter.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you very much, John, for sharing your expertise and perspective on ESG investing and sustainable finance.
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating discussion on how finance can be a driver of sustainability and real-world impact. To our listeners, we'll be back soon with the next episode of the Climate Talk series, bringing you more experts' insights to help us better understand and navigate the challenges of climate change together.
Thanks so much for your leadership in having this series.
Thank you very much. Until then, stay informed and thank you for joining us.